Hi everyone. In the previous learning outcome, we talked about how the hypothalamus will influence the function of the pituitary gland. And so on this learning outcome number 4 of module 1, we'll be talking specifically about the functions of the pituitary gland hormones. We will start with the posterior pituitary gland because it's easier. It only releases 2 hormones, which we already know, that are the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. Both of them are going to be released by specific nuclei. The antidiuretic hormone will be released by the supraoptic nucleus, and the oxytocin will be released by the paraventricular nucleus. In both cases, these hormones will travel from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary by means of these axons that are coming from these nuclei. There is a simple mnemonic that you can use to remember those hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary, which is antioxidant, anti for antidiuretic hormone, and oxy for the oxytocin. Let's start with the antidiuretic hormone, which can also be called vasopressin. If you can remember that a diuretic is a medication that you can take to eliminate water from your body. Therefore, an antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that will prevent water from leaving your body because it's against being a diuretic. Therefore, the antidiuretic hormone is released in response to an increase in the concentration of blood electrolytes. If you have too much electrolytes, the water will want to leave with those electrolytes. Therefore, you want to prevent the water loss in the kidneys, and that's when the antidiuretic hormone is released to prevent the water loss in the kidneys. In addition, the antidiuretic hormone is also released when you have a low blood volume and a low blood pressure. One way that you can increase the blood volume and the blood pressure is by constricting the peripheral blood vessels, and that's a function of the antidiuretic hormone. By constricting the blood vessels, you're able to increase the blood pressure because there will be less space for the blood to circulate, and this will definitely increase the blood pressure. Next, we have oxytocin, which will have an influence in females and in males. Oxytocin is the love hormone or the cuddle hormone. There are several studies that show the importance of this hormone being released right before labor. It is the hormone that will help the bonding between the mom and the newborn. Therefore, in females, it will stimulate contraction of the uterine smooth muscle to help in the labor and delivery process, and it will also stimulate the mammary glands to eject the milk that's being produced. With regards to males, it will also have a function of contraction, but in this case, it will help the smooth muscle in the prostate gland contract to release the contents. And we will definitely talk more about all these processes when we get to the reproductive system. But just remember that oxytocin is important mainly for contraction, either of the uterine smooth muscle, of the prostate gland smooth muscle, or of the mammary glands to be able to help with milk ejection. And this slide is just a summary of what we went over with regards to the posterior pituitary hormones. Remember that these hormones that are in the posterior pituitary, they're coming from the hypothalamus. So this means that there's a direct release of the hormones from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary. We have 2, the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone can also be called vasopressin. Remember that it will be able to contract the blood vessels, therefore vasopressin, and they will target the kidneys with regards to the reabsorption of water. So they want to make sure that they increase blood volume, that they increase blood pressure, and that they increase the reabsorption of water inside of the kidneys, and therefore more water stays inside of the body. Oxytocin will target in females the uterus and the mammary glands. In uterus, it will help with labor contractions, and in the mammary glands, it will help with milk ejection. In males, mainly prostate gland, a little bit of ductus deferens, but the resulting will be the contraction of both the ductus deferens and the prostate gland, and this will cause the ejection of the secretion of these two structures. Now let's talk about the anterior pituitary. Remember that first, the hypothalamus is the one that will produce separate hormones that will stimulate or inhibit the hormone production in the anterior pituitary gland. When a hormone stimulates the release of other hormones, we call them tropic hormones. Therefore, the hypothalamus hormones are tropic hormones because once they are released, they will stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete hormones, more specifically the anterior pituitary gland. And this is in response to the presence of the hormones that were secreted by the hypothalamus. And we can add that all the hormones that are coming from the hypothalamus will be called releasing hormones. Remember, we talked about this because their presence will help the release of other hormones. Now, don't get the word tropic confused with tropin, which we saw earlier, which basically means that it will have a stimulating effect. And again, once the hormones are released from the hypothalamus, they will reach the anterior pituitary through the hypophyseal portal veins. Now, the hormones that are released in the anterior pituitary are listed here. We have the thyroid stimulating hormone, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, the follicle stimulating hormone, the luteinizing hormone, prolactin, melanocyte stimulating hormone, and growth hormone. So we have 7 different hormones. The first 4 are what we consider tropic hormones, meaning that they will either turn on or turn off the function of other endocrine glands. Now, which hormones that are coming from the hypothalamus will stimulate the release of the hormones on the anterior pituitary? Well, this is really simple. So the growth hormone, releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus will stimulate the release and production of growth hormone in the anterior pituitary. The thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus will stimulate the thyroid stimulating hormone that will then have an effect on the thyroid gland. Next, we have the corticotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus, and this will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release what we call the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will have a function on the adrenal gland. Then we have the gonadotropin releasing hormone that will stimulate the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that will act on the gonads. So gonadotropin releasing hormone acts on the gonads. Then we have prolactin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus that will stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce prolactin, which will stimulate lactation or the milk production by the mammary glands. Remember that oxytocin stimulates the ejection of the milk, but prolactin stimulates the production of the milk. The last one is the melanocyte stimulating hormone, which does not have a hormone coming from the hypothalamus. In fact, this hormone will be released right over here on this area, which is between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, which is called the pars intermedia. And this hormone is released by the stimulation of UV light. So when you're exposed to the sun, you will have the release and the stimulation of the production of the melanocyte stimulating hormone, and we will cover this in more details coming up. It's a little bit hard to think about mnemonics for all these different hormones. This is the one that I like to use because flat will contain all your tropic hormones. So F for follicle stimulating hormone, L for luteinizing hormone, A for adrenocorticotropic hormone, and T for thyroid stimulating hormone. And ProMag will represent Pro for prolactin, Mag for melanocyte stimulating hormone, and the G for the growth hormone. This last slide is showing a review of what we talked about in the previous slide with regards to the anterior pituitary gland. But remember that now the hypothalamus is going to have an indirect control through the release of these regulatory hormones. So the thyrotropin releasing hormone will have an effect on the anterior pituitary gland by releasing the thyroid stimulating hormone, and these will target specific cells on the thyroid gland to produce T3 and T4. Then we have the corticotropin releasing hormone released by the hypothalamus that will release adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary gland, and this will target the suprarenal cortex to secrete glucocorticoid. Then we have the gonadotropin releasing hormone that will act on the anterior pituitary gland to release the gonadotropins, which are two, the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. Both of them will have an influence in males and females with regards to the follicle stimulating hormone. In females, it will be responsible for the follicle development and secretion of estrogen, and in males, it will be responsible for sperm maturation. With regards to the luteinizing hormone, it will target follicular cells in the ovaries and interstitial cells in the testes. In females, it will be responsible for ovulation, the corpus luteum formation during the ovulation process, and progesterone secretion. And in males, it will be responsible for the release of testosterone. Then we have the prolactin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. Once it reaches the anterior pituitary, it will secrete prolactin. Prolactin will target the female mammary glands to produce milk, not eject. Ejection is oxytocin that will come from the posterior pituitary gland. Prolactin will function to produce the milk. Next, we have the growth hormone releasing hormone, which will activate the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. And growth hormone has several different functions throughout the entire body. One of the functions, like the name says, is that it will cause growth. It will also help with protein synthesis, lipid mobilization because it needs a lot of energy, and also catabolism. The melanocyte stimulating hormone is a little bit different, and we will talk about it later on. It is released from the anterior pituitary gland, but not from the main part of the anterior pituitary gland. There is an intermediate part where it's released from. And this does not have a hypothalamus hormone that will stimulate the secretion of this hormone. The stimulation to release this hormone comes from the exposure to UV light. And this hormone will act and target melanocytes in the production of melanin. So make sure that you keep this in mind, and we will cover all these in more details in the next learning outcomes.